All right. Hi, everyone. As we just said, I'm going to talk today about UX design and education for effective monitoring tools. I'll start off by going over what we're going to cover today. I'm going to talk about my background, my company's scale, and what level we're working at, why this is an important topic for everybody who's at this conference. Then we're going to split up the design principles we're going to talk about into two broad categories of like how to share what you know, because in my case, you might be the expert for whatever tools you're offering to your company. And then we're going to talk about designing what your users want. And then we're going to go over and make sure everyone remembers all the things we talked about today. And so we'll talk about the background. I'm Amy. I've been an engineer at Pinterest since 2015. That's a picture of me when I started at Pinterest. It's good. Please keep laughing. It makes it more fun. Some of the things that we've worked on, or at least I've worked on in the past year, include using Zipkin for this network tracing to improve our performance, using D3 to create data visualizations, a cache for OpenTSDB time series data, and like the most documentation in the world. And I just realized I forgot to mention that I'm on the monitoring team or the visibility team at Pinterest. And so what we do is we provide information to all of our engineers about latency and error counts and site reliability data. You can reach me at all of these places online, but you can see it at the bottom as well. So let me tell you about Pinterest in case you haven't heard of it or tried it. Pinterest is the world's first visual discovery engine. We help people discover and do what they love. You can save items onto your boards. And so in terms of our scale, we have 175 million monthly active users, 100 billion pins, 2 billion boards, 2 billion searches every month. And those are all really cool numbers that I got from our PR team, and they told me to put it in the slide, so I did. But I think the more important numbers are our monitoring numbers. Oh, shoot, and 150,000 requests served per second. So for our monitoring side, what we use is Graphite, OpenTSDB, Kafka, Storm, Spark, ELK, Sumologic, Zipkin. We've tried a lot of tools. I didn't include all of them, but those are the big ones. In terms of numbers, we log about 100 terabytes per day, and then and that's in S3. We save about 300 gigabytes per day for ad hoc querying. We ingest 2.5 million metrics per second. And I think the most important number is that we have over 400 engineers. And the reason why I think that's the most important number is because I like to think of engineers as our customers, because we are the ones providing them the tools that help them process all this data. And so I want to tell you about some of the tools that we've built in-house today. Our biggest tool that we built in-house that's about 4 years old is StatsBoard. It's a graphing web application where you can type in metrics and build your own dashboard so you can go there and see what's going on with your service. You can also explore metrics without building a dashboard, so you can type things in, examine it, run some functions on it, and then explore that data. And you can build your own alerts in our UI. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we designed these tools to be better. But before that, I want to talk to you about why, even if you don't have your own in-house app, why you might care about this. So the big question is, why should we care about user experience? For monitoring, or if you're in site reliability or you're some sort of infrastructure engineer, you might be saying, like, why should I care about user experience when there's so many other things that I could care about? Like, I want to build an in-memory time series database, I want to use Zipkin, I want to do all these other things. The user experience isn't secondary. And so a lot of people would say, like, at least in our case, we have an in-house tool. If the tool sucks, people can't go anywhere else. It's not like there's an alternative. So if it sucks, well, it doesn't matter. That's all they have. But I guess I would answer that with another question, which is, have you ever used the Graphite UI? I have not, because I just get upset when I look at this. And have you ever used the OpenTSDB UI? And what I really want to say about this screenshot is, like, it wasn't intentional, but I was trying to create the screenshot, so I went through and typed in some metrics at my company, and I realized that somehow the metric name wraps around to the other side, and that makes no sense to me. Like, what is happening here? And you can't even interact with the graphs. So I don't know anybody who actually uses the OpenTSDB UI. I'm sure most of you might use Datadog or Wavefront or SignalFX or some vendors, or you might query it through curl. But the OpenTSDB UI, nobody wants it, unless you work at OpenTSDB. I'm not sure. So I really want to crystallize this with like some really explicit reasons why at least I think we should care about user experience. And the first one would be that it helps people prevent misunderstandings. Not everyone at your company has to understand time series data in order to do their jobs. At least at Pinterest, we have people who work on growth or SEO, or we have people work on internationalization, and all of those people need monitoring data, but that doesn't mean that they should be pros at it. And so it's your job to help people figure out that data, or for your job, you can map, like not everyone has to be a site reliability engineer or what your role is at your company. And then the second reason is developer velocity. You want people to reach conclusions faster, and you want to help your company move faster. In our case, our biggest customers would be our site reliability team. So, if they're waking up at 3 a.m. because something went wrong, and they're trying to use your data to figure out what went wrong, you don't want them to take like 30 minutes to figure out. You want them to figure it out and go back to sleep as quickly as possible. And then the third reason is data democracy. As I'd mentioned before, Pinterest has tons of engineers across different functions, and we don't know what kinds of questions those people have to ask. So whether it's like, Pinterest is down in Brazil, why is that? Or why is the latency so slow in Tokyo but not anywhere else? Those are questions you could ask with monitoring data. You can like slice and dice that data. But my team, at least, does not understand like what kinds of problems another team is going through. We want them to be able to figure it out on their own because they have their own questions. And so this ties into one of my favorite ideas about software engineering, which is that the fastest way to become a 10x engineer is to help 10 other engineers do their jobs better. I think there's so many different ways to be a strong engineer, but when you're working as a support engineer, which is why I consider myself I am supporting other engineers, I think that if I help other people do their jobs better or faster, then I've done a good job. I'm not really sure who said this, so that's why I'm attributing it to Michael Scott. And so, I said all this stuff like, we gotta prevent misunderstandings, we gotta do developer velocity and data democracy. And I think those are really complicated buzzwords, and I don't think anyone's gonna remember that. So what I really want you to remember is that, not all of this, but that if we care about user experience, we can help engineers work correctly, quickly, and independently. So that's the summary of why we should care. And now I want to talk about your situation, because again, I realize not everyone builds monitoring tools here, not everyone builds their own tools at all, but you might have a bash script that everyone passes around from team to team. You might have some other UI tools, but it's not just about UI. What I really want to say is that user experience, when you're working in a supportive role, as an infrastructure engineer, where you're supporting the rest of your company, user experience is about how people interact with, what the experience people have it's about the experience of working with your team. And so what I really want to say is that when you're thinking about priorities for how to improve your user experience, you should be thinking about your team first. And what I mean by that is if someone asks your team a question, do you make them feel terrible about it? Do you make them feel incompetent? Do you ignore their questions? Does it take more than 24 hours for that question to get answered? That's a part of your user experience. And then next, you want to talk about your documentation. If your documentation is outdated, if it's straight up wrong, if it doesn't make any sense or the instructions aren't easy to follow, that's a part of your user experience too. And then, after you've thought about all your team and your documentation and experience of working with all of that, that's when you can probably start thinking about your tools. So although I'm going to be talking a lot about tools, I really want you to think about everything about your team. And then I realized that making a triangle with only 3 colors was weird, so I didn't know what to put on the 4th triangle. So I think that probably if you want to go to the next level, you can pay for vendors. You can probably buy Datadog. I think they have a really great user experience. We can't afford Datadog, but that's another talk. So what I really want to say is, this talk, we will be talking a lot about tools and all the great things we did, but everyone in this room can control how your team, the user experience of your team and your documentation. And so I hope that the ideas that we have can be transferred to all of these different ideas. So now we can talk about all the design principles that are important, including sharing what we know. So the first principle I have to suggest when you're thinking about how to share the information you know is that you should not overload people with too much information. And you might be thinking like, oh, I never do that. But it's really easy to not notice when you end up spending more than like 10 minutes explaining a concept to someone because you're really excited about it and you want them to know all of the things that you've thought about. And that's not what people generally want. And so let me give an example of this. I want you to think about what you think this means. So I have my metric, and I want to alert on when it's greater than 5. And so you might think, it means whenever that metric passes the number 5, that's when the alert happens. Your company might do something different. You might wait a few seconds or something like that. And so at Pinterest, sometimes people ask me this, and I used to say, like, oh, it means you take your metric, you look at the last 10 minutes, and then you take the average of that, and then you check if it's greater than 5. And the reason that we have to do this is because, oh, well, if you don't, then you might have like intermittent spikes, and then you might alert like 10 times in a row if it keeps passing number 5 and going back and forth. Or you might need to wait like 5 minutes just to see if it was like a anomaly and not really an important alert. And then I would say all this stuff, and people would be like, what are you saying? Like, what's the point of that? I didn't really want to know all that information. So you might have situations like that in your own work. And so one thing we realized is we had this alert builder, as I had mentioned. At the bottom, you can see aggregate series by average. I was in favor of us making like a whole explanation there, explaining what aggregate series by average means. But my teammates were kind of like, nobody's going to read that. Nobody's going to read like a whole paragraph if you explain it there. People don't really care. So I got voted down. We changed it to just aggregate series by average, and then we decided at least that if people wanted to know what that means, they could just ask us directly. But we shouldn't bog people down with too much information in our UI. And so what we realized is that most people, actually what they're doing is they're just looking at the top part. They're saying, oh, my alert is right here in the red, like red. I think you can tell. Okay, so dark red means that it's going to email you or it's going to page you. Light pink means that your alert went off, but it's going to need to wait a few minutes based on your settings to make sure that the alert continues to be triggering before it notifies. And so once we added this to our UI where people could just say, oh, this is where my alert's going to happen, people didn't need to think so hard about like what it meant to write an alert. They could just keep tweaking it, testing it, tweaking it, testing it, and seeing when the red matched up with what they said should be red. And so that's one way we made it so that people could use their intuition and say, I know when I feel like I should be alerted, as opposed to I know all of the weird things that we're doing to make alerts happen in the background. And there is a place where you can write or you can explain things to your heart's content, and that's your FAQ or your wiki page or your Google Docs. In our case, we use Graphite and OpenTSDB. People sometimes wanted to know the difference, but most people didn't care where the data was coming from. You could write all of that stuff out, and then people can go and read it if they feel like it. So the next thing I want to talk about is your best practices. And so you can use your expertise to figure out what the most helpful default behavior is. In our case, we used to have these all blank. And so you'd have to figure out, like, oh, I want 10 minutes, or I want to aggregate by average as opposed to some other aggregation method. I want to check it every 30 seconds. If you put things in as a default, it means that people don't have to think so hard about what they want to type in here. And we want to make it like as seamless as possible. People can just write in their metric and what their threshold is, and then kind of ignore the rest of this unless they actively want to tweak it. So the last thing is to think about pitfalls, and this kind of ties back into the best practices. You want to make it as hard as possible for people to do the wrong thing. You have all the expertise about how to use your tools correctly, and you can kind of subtly guide people away from doing the wrong thing. In our case, one issue we had was that people often wanted the alert to do what they were expecting it to do, which is what I mentioned before. Like they wanted to say, when my number passes 5, then alert. And what we realized is that that's not the right thing to do because it takes like anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes for all of the data to come into our hosts. We have like 1,000 different Amazon hosts. They are all reporting metrics to OpenTSDB. It might take like up to 15 minutes for all of that data to get in and get processed and aggregated. So if you actually use the final point, meaning the last point in the time series, that number is always going to be incomplete. So we don't want people to use final point. And what we did here is we just kind of buried it in the dropdown. We don't have any specific ways to prevent people from clicking on it, but because it's in the dropdown and not the default choice, people generally don't go and click on it. And I got shot down when I suggested that we use Clippy. Maybe we could have a little pop-up that says, hey, don't do that. Apparently Clippy is not a good UX. I thought it was great. So I think there could be ways where we could make warnings if people choose final point, but for now we just bury it in the dropdown. Next I want to talk about designing what your users want. So in terms of performance, people have so many feelings when they use your tools, and almost all of those feelings are bad. And in our case, that's because it's our site reliability team who's using most of this data. If people are looking at your data or your metrics, it's always error counts or latency data, and they're always upset because that means something's broken. So you want to make it as fast as possible. That's the number one thing that we get from our users, is that we want the data to be there as quickly as possible. And so in this case, I would say you could have another hour-long talk about what it means to do performance for time series data, and there's so many cool things you could do. I want to give a really quick survey of all the things that Pinterest has been thinking about doing, and then if you want to learn more about any of these things, we can talk about it after. But let's just go through it real fast. Backend, you could roll up data over long time ranges. For the last day of data, we usually keep about 10-second resolution of data, but we've been talking about how maybe over a week you only need 1 hour resolution, or maybe for a month you only need 1 day resolution for your data. So maybe you could roll things up. You could store the latest data in memory. So if you could check out the Gorilla paper if you want. I'll post these slides after in case you want to click on these links. They have an open source version of it called the Barenge project. It's really funny because Barenge is a kind of gorilla. I didn't get that. But you can store things in memory. You can add a caching layer, so your data is, again, it's queried in memory as opposed to from the database. But all of that takes super long. Who's gonna roll up data and do that within a week? And I said low-hanging fruit, and I feel I kind of lied about that because there are not so many low-hanging fruit in backend. So what I really want to say is that in the front end, you can have all these cool tricks that make people feel like the data is coming in faster, even if it's actually the same backend performance. And this is something that we can all think about, even though we're maybe, at least I'm not a JavaScript pro. If a user starts out with 1 hour of data or 2 hours of data and they expand it to a day of data, just don't reload that extra data. It makes people feel like they're not wasting time. And in our case, we actually still make it so if you click on the 1 hour and then you click on the 6 hours, we reload the whole 6 hours. And people get mad about that a lot. So you can do some Ajax magic and make only the new data reload. You can prevent the user from requesting data incessantly, and this is a OpenTSDB specific problem, but if you keep refreshing and you keep making a ton of requests at a time, OpenTSD will just stop responding to any requests. I think that's a poor design decision, but if you're detecting that users refreshing the page a lot and it actually is having an impact on your load, maybe you can just stop them from doing that, as in not send the requests. And then the last thing you can do is lazy load graphs on your dashboards. If you have 20 different graphs and you just send out an Ajax request for all of them at once, then sometimes the graphs at the bottom will load even if they're not on the page, and then the ones that are on the page will just time out. So you might as well prioritize the graphs that are on the screen. And so these are all cool UI tricks that you can do to make people feel like everything's going more quickly. And the point is that would be more low-hanging fruit than the backend side. And as a disclaimer, we haven't done all these things. These are all in our roadmap for the next couple of months, but I think they're all good ideas. And the second thing that people are feeling is people are usually anxious or afraid when it comes to using your tools. And so you want to make it okay for them to explore without feeling like they're going to break things or like they're going to do something wrong. And in our case, we have this really great graph building UI, and we realized that people were afraid of losing their data. They'd type in all the stuff here, and then maybe they'd refresh the page and it would all be gone. And so what we did, it seems really simple, but not everyone does this. You really have to make sure your back buttons and your refresh buttons are not broken if you're doing a bunch of JavaScript. So if you're loading up graphs without reloading the page, the back button is automatically broken, but you can just pay attention to it and make sure you're adding things to the back and forth stack using JavaScript. And this is really important for us because that means that people can then type in a metric and then type in a different metric. And as they think, I want to go back, they can actually just click the back button. Before, they would go back, and then they'd go back to the Statsport homepage and lose all of their, lose what they were working on. Same with the refresh button. And then you want people to be able to use the curl, the URL, and then you want them to be able to send the same link to their friends or to their coworkers on Slack without having to make people reconstruct the graph. We had people just taking screenshots and saying, look at this, and then other people would go onto their own laptops and type in the same exact metric. And no, you don't have to do that. Why don't we just keep all that data inside the URLs that people can restfully send the same graphs? And so those are some ways we made it easier for people to explore without feeling like they're going to lose their data. And then in this case, what we did is, well, as I mentioned before, you can just see your preview. So in this case, you can explore. And the difference is that in the past, what we did is we required people to type in their alerts into a YAML file, run Statsport locally, and then check if their alert would work. And if you forgot to type in the no-op flag, then you would just get email spammed yourself if you wrote your alert wrong. And nobody wants to get spammed with alerts just because they're testing out something. And so that's why we built the previewer. And then the third thing is that people want it to be as easy as possible to figure out what to do. And I realize that that's I'm not giving very actionable advice here. Everyone wants things to be easy to do. But I want to show you all what you look like when you say that you've made things easy to do. So here's Skinner from The Simpsons. He's saying, am I wrong? No, everyone else is wrong. And what I mean by that is that we often say, I know what's best. I know what people want. I'm going to design it how I think it should be. But we're not always the best judges of what other people want to do. And so in our case, we designed this really simple graph builder where you could just type in metrics and it would get appended and appended like in a notebook style. So you could type in a metric and then you type in the next metric and it would keep coming. And so what people said is they don't like this. They just wanted to see one graph at a time. They didn't need all that history. And this UI was just confusing. And I personally thought it was not that complicated. Or at least I thought it was a pretty straightforward way of saying I want to keep my history and I want to be able to type in my metrics. But because people said that they didn't like it, that means that we weren't doing our job, and so we had to make it better. And so that's how the other thing that people were complaining about was that we had to type out our metrics in this text input field, which is really weird because that means on our side we had to parse this data and then send it, request it to OpenTSDB using a JSON. So it was kind of weird that we were even making people type things out in the syntax. But what you'd have to do here is type out your metric manually. Maybe you had it on a Post-it note or you had it saved in an email. You type out your metric and hope that you got the right metric. You had to remember which aggregator you wanted, whether that's sum or max or average. You had to know all of the tags that you wanted for this metric. So you had to know which tags were available. And then you could also do some secret bonus options. Everything else was required, but you could also downsample if you wanted to. But not everyone knew about that. And so we realized that people just didn't like writing out the syntax. And so that's garbage. And so that's why we switched to the graph builder UI, where at the bottom you can see that you type in your metric, and then you get all these tags. You get all these options that you don't necessarily have to touch. So if you want to switch from OpenTSDB to Graphite, you could. If you want to switch from sum to a different aggregator, or a different rate or a different downsample, it was all there for you. So you knew exactly which options exist. So you don't know if there's no secrets. If you missed the old way where you could just type, instead of clicking around buttons, you could just type in whatever you want, and then we could automatically go back to the old way. Again, there's tags so that you don't have to remember which ones exist, and all these are really great elements that just make it easier for people to get to their data without having to remember so much. And so here's everything we have to say about designing what your users want. You should remember that people are usually frustrated and they want the performance to be better. They're confused or they're scared, so they want to be able to explore without breaking something, and they want it to be as simple as possible. So to recap, well, I want to say a from the beginning is that the fastest way to become a 10x engineer is to help 10 other engineers do better. And I hope that if there's only like one thing you remember from this, it's that that's what you can do. Even if your job does not require you to design different tools, or it doesn't require you to work directly with other, build tools for other engineers, it's really important that you think about how your work impacts everyone else at your company. And again, that doesn't always mean tools, it means the team and the documentation and everything else that related to your team as well. And on the sharing side, you can think about education versus intuition. Just let people feel out what's right. Make sure that they're using the best practices, because you are the one who knows the best practices, and you want to just lead them away from things that you wouldn't advise. And on the design side, you want to make sure that people have something that's fast, explorable, and simple. Cool, thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Do you guys have any questions? No? Okay. Great. Good talk. Thanks. Oh, there is a question. Sorry.
We can't let somebody leave without a question. In building this new UI, what would you have to say was your biggest challenge in setting it up? Because I can imagine that there was a lot of things coming together. So what was the biggest challenge, and how did you tackle it?
I would say that the biggest challenge would be, so my team is 8 people big, and we realized, for almost every single feature, someone had an opinion about how to do it the right way. And so we realized that it's not always designed by committee. Sometimes you do have to assign one person to make the decision and say, this is the way we're going forward, otherwise we're not making any progress. This is really specific, but the legend, we had over an hour of arguments about where to put the legend. And that was the most frustrating thing to me, because some people wanted the legend to appear when you mouse over it, but other people were saying, if you put the legend where the mouse is, then you'll cover the graph. Why don't we put it on the bottom? But if you put it on the bottom, then you have to scroll back and forth. So we had a lot of debate about that and other features up here. So the challenge was, I guess, realizing that we didn't have to get consensus to move forward on something. And then the second thing is that none of our team knew JavaScript or web UI, anything about React or web development, because we're all infrastructure engineers. So actually we ended up hiring someone for front-end development specifically for us. And I think that just was a game changer, because then I literally was drawing up pictures this is what I want you to build, here you go. And I didn't have to worry about all of the JavaScript bullshit that I was talking about. More questions? But I think it's lunch right now, so maybe you're all tired, but I will be out there, so come ask me questions.
Cool. Thanks again.